Meet Grace Stewart, a devout Catholic who enforces strict rules to protect her children from sunlight due to their rare medical condition. She lives in a desolate mansion with her 2 children after World War II. 3 servants, Mrs. Mill, Mr. Tuttle, and Lydia, arrives at the mansion, as Grace was expecting. She welcomes them and immediately begins assigning roles in the household. In this house, a door must not be opened without the previous one being closed first. The curtains of the house must be closed whenever the 2 children, Anne and Nicholas, are around, and silence is cherished in this household. In search of servants, Grace wrote an advertisement letter that was to be taken by the postman to the newspaper. However, this letter was never published because the postman never came to take the letter. So, how did these servants get to know about the vacancy at Mrs. Grace's household? She immediately summons Mrs. Mill, who was the head servant, to explain how she got to know about the vacancy. Mrs. Mills then explains that she knows that big houses like Mrs. Grace's always need someone who knows the rules. So, she decided to stop by to see if there was a vacancy, in which she was lucky to find one. Mrs. Grace is satisfied with this answer. She later learns that Mrs. Mill and her cohort used to work in this house a few years ago. In the next scene, we see Grace teaching her children how to study and about the reality of hell. Then, she separates them into different rooms to study and goes to the living room to discuss with Mrs. Mills. Suddenly, she hears crying and immediately rushes into the room where her son was reading. However, he wasn't the one crying. She also runs to her daughter, but she was not the one crying either. When she asks her daughter who was crying, her daughter tells her that it was a boy named Victor. But Grace doesn't believe this because apart from the maids, no one else lives with them in the house. She questions how a boy could get in and out of the room if the door was locked. Upon looking towards the direction of the door, she finds it open. She immediately summons the servants to question them about the open door because her children's lives were at stake. However, she later reinforces one of their rules, that no door must be opened without the previous one being closed first. Anne later gets punished for scaring her brother by telling him that someone else was in the room with them, and for opening the curtains of the window. In the next scene we saw that Grace continues to hear strange voices and movements around the house. She immediately started searching for the intruders who were disturbing her peace. Then again her daughter, Anne, shows her a drawing of a family whom she says she has seen in the house, so Grace to continue to search for these intruders. In the process of searching she found a book, and in this book she saw pictures of people who looked as if they were asleep, but they were not asleep, they were actually dead. This book is called a Book of the Dead. After a futile search, she later gave up and retired to bed. From the music room Grace heard the piano being played and immediately ran in there to see who was playing the piano, but when she got there, there was no one in the music room. Now she thinks there's something demonic causing unrest in the house, so she goes out to find the priest. Outside, Grace loses herself in the heavy fog, but she miraculously discovers her husband Charles, who she thought had been killed in the war, and brings him back to the house. Charles is distant during the one day he spends in the house, and Mrs. Mills is heard telling Mr. Tuttle, "I do not think he knows where he is." Grace later sees an old woman dressed up like her daughter. Grace says, "You are not my daughter," and attacks her. However, she finds that she has actually attacked her daughter instead. Anne refuses to be near her mother afterward, while Grace swears she saw the old woman. Mrs. Mills tells Anne that she too has seen the people, but they cannot yet tell the mother because Grace will not accept what she is not ready for. Charles is stunned when Anne tells him the things her mother did to her. He says he must leave for the front and disappears again. After Charles leaves, Anne continues to see things, including Victor's whole family and the old woman. Grace breaks down to Mrs. Mills, who claims that, sometimes the world of the dead gets mixed up with the world of the living. One morning, Grace wakes to the children's screams. All of the curtains in the house have disappeared, as Anne had said they might. When the servants refuse to help look for them, Grace realizes that they are somehow involved. Hiding the children from the light, she banishes the servants from the house. A series of loud noises from the upper story of the house follows this event. That night, Anne and Nicholas sneak out of the house to find their father and stumble across the hidden graves. They find that the graves belong to the servants. At the same time, Grace goes to the servants' quarters and finds a photograph from the Book of the Dead and is horrified to see that it is of the 3 servants. The servants appear and follow after the children, who make it back into the house just as Grace emerges to hold off the servants with a shotgun. They then say that they had died of tuberculosis more than 50 years before. The children run upstairs and hide but are found by the strange old woman. Downstairs, the servants continue talking to Grace, telling her that the living and the dead have to learn to live together. Upstairs, Anne and Nicholas discover the old woman is acting as a medium in a seance with Victor's parents. It is then that they learn the truth. The real ghosts are none other than Anne, Nicholas, and their mother, who is believed to have killed them in a fit of psychosis before committing suicide. Grace loses her temper and supernaturally attacks the visitors by ripping and throwing pieces of paper that lay on the table. However, the visitors are only able to see the paper ripping of its own accord, further confirming Grace and her children are indeed the ghosts. The truth finally clear to Grace, she breaks down with the children and remembers what happened just before the arrival of their new servants. Stricken with grief for her missing husband and increasingly frustrated by living in isolation, she went insane, smothered her children with a pillow, and then, in shock after realizing what she had done, put a rifle to her forehead and pulled the trigger. When nothing happened and upon hearing the laughter of Nicholas and Anne, Grace assumed that God had granted her family a miracle by offering them a second chance at life. Grace and the children realize that Charles is also dead, but he is not aware of it. Mrs. Mills appears and informs Grace that they will learn to get along, and sometimes won't even notice the living people who inhabit their house. She also informs them that since the children no longer have their mortal bodies, they are no longer sensitive to light, and for the first time the children freely enjoy the sunlight coming through the windows. From the window, Grace and her children look out as Victor's family moves out.